In a lull in the fighting on the Russian front, two German men engage in an urgent conversation. Hans, the commander, has just received the news that the next Russian attack is on its way. You can hear the sounds of machine gun fire and artillery in the background. He reassures his troops, let's see how these commies deal with a crack SS division. Hans seems confident, self-assured, and there is no doubt in his mind about what he is doing. However, Hans' friend is much less confident. His face is full of doubt and confusion as he approaches Hans for reassurance. Hans says to him, "Have courage, friend." But his friend, in a much less certain voice, says to him, "Hans, I've noticed something." To which Hans declares, "All these communists are cowards." His friend fails to acknowledge this and continues, "Hans, have you looked at our caps recently?" Hans, a little confused, "Our hats?" His friend, "Yes, the badge on our caps." Hans demurs, "No, yes, maybe a bit." Hans' friend says in a whiny and concerned voice, "They've got skulls on them." And then asks, "Have you noticed that our hats have little badges with pictures of skulls on them?" Hans is now quite flustered. He comments, "You've seen the Allies, for example, all stars and eagles and things that evoke goodness, whereas skulls make you think of cannibals, pirates, and death." Hans' friend then asks him outright, "Hans, are we the baddies?" This skit from 2006 is from the show That Mitchell and Webb Look, and it's a humorous reflection on symbolism, enemies, and self-awareness that is perhaps all the more poignant because although it should have been self-evident that they were in the wrong, people rarely recognise how they are colluding with evil whilst committed to the act. Much ink has been spilled over why this is, why people would continue to collude with, for example, fascists and cult leaders long after any pretense of goodness has been abandoned. And let's face it, right-wing extremism, fascism, and cults are in the same category of luring people in with promises of a better life, indoctrination, and then outright control of people's lives. People are gaslit. That is, their sense of what is real and not is deliberately distorted to suit the charismatic leader. You know the lines that they might use, like, "I'm just asking questions," or "I've done my own research," which sounds reasonable if it weren't an outright lie. They are cut off from their normal social interactions that might give balance or perspective to their view of life, made to feel like their welfare depends on the whims of the leader. This induces Stockholm syndrome, where the person tries to please a leader in order to stay safe, even coming to believe that they love them. The sunk cost fallacy even comes into play, the one that gets gamblers so often, where I've invested so much already, I might as well try and get my investment back by doubling down. But perhaps the most sinister thing that people like the MAGA cult do is draw a metaphorical line between people and say that these are the good guys, that is us, and they are the bad guys. And every effort to rescue the person by arguing with them, telling them that they are in a cult, indoctrinated, or just wrong, reinforces the view that the cult is the good guys and everyone else is baddies. This is so sinister because whether you like it or not, it's kind of human nature for us to group people into good and bad, smart and stupid, sinner and saint, righteous and unrighteous. Famously, in Paul's writings, we see that the Jews and Jewish converts to Christianity do this with circumcision. Circumcised good, uncircumcised Gentile sinner. Or the Gentile Christians who did it to the Jews, who wouldn't eat food that was sacrificed to idols. Christian freedom good, fearing idols bad. And we do it all the time too. Maybe it's frustration with those evangelical Christians over there, so judgmental and legalistic. Or with the liberal Christians over there, do they really believe in God? Or perhaps it's division along political lines like Liberal, Labor and the Greens, where those guys over there are our enemies. They will destroy everything that we stand for, even though what we stand for should actually be standing for democracy and freedom. People more and more would happily sacrifice freedom and democracy to stop their enemy's ideology from being in government. And don't even get me started on the deadliest of rivalries and the bitterest of foes in our society today. Port Adelaide versus the Crows. Kiwis and Aussies, Scottish and English, Americans and English, Indians and English, the English and the English, Americans and Mexicans. If someone can convince you to other a group of people, put them on the opposite side of that imaginary line, get you to think of them as an enemy and think of them as less than human, they have you, and you'll be that much easier to control. Hans and his friend did not wake up one day on the Russian front with skulls on their caps. They were convinced over time that their lives would be better if it weren't for those others over there. That their natural tendency to divide up humanity into good and bad was correct, and oh look, we just happen to be on the good side. What a coincidence. Jesus refuses to play these kind of games. Because Jesus is not a cult leader, he is our liberator. Jesus refuses to use cult-like tactics to win people into the kingdom because he is our saviour. Jesus' way is not controlling, not othering, not fostering dependence upon him. Jesus empowers us, frees us from slavery to sin and death, and liberates us to fulfill the fullness of the potential that God has given each of us to live out our purpose in loving God through loving one another. Jesus refuses to divide people into the kind of categories that we are so prone to use to separate people along invisible lines. He refuses to let us put ourselves in the good guy or the bad guy, for that matter, category. Because none is righteous, not one, but all are made righteous in him. All are found on the side of right because of him. We see it in Paul's writing where he tells the church that it is not keeping any law, nor is it circumcision, that marks the line that divides good from bad. There is no line. There is only trusting in the way of Jesus. And we see it in our passage today, where Jesus destroys the line between good guy and bad guy, between friend and enemy, between us and them, between people and others. He does it by commanding us to love our enemies, doing good to them, blessing them, and giving to them without restraint. He tells us not to judge people as others, condemning them before we even know them in our hearts. Instead, Jesus wants us to empathize with them, to do to them what we would have them do to us. Be merciful. Recognize that what we dish out is what we will get back. Jesus wants us to walk a mile in their shoes, so to speak, by thinking about how we would like to be treated. He is encouraging us to think about how others, there's that word again, would like to be treated. So that there is no longer others, only those that we love. It is important to note here that he is not saying that we don't have healthy boundaries or protect ourselves from the harm that others do. How would that be loving yourself equally with your neighbour? And in fact, if we don't set boundaries with people, we are not loving them. We are saying, I don't care how much you hurt me and yourself. I'd just rather not go to the trouble of working this out with you. And how can we love someone if we don't allow them to see who we are and what matters to us enough that we set a boundary? Loving our enemies means setting appropriate boundaries with meaningful and enforceable consequences so that they can know the real us and we the real them. Please do not leave believing God wants to subject you to harm, abuse, or violence. That is not the point. The point is that we do not dehumanize others by labeling them enemy and writing them off. Jesus' injunction that we love our enemies, dissolving the line between good guys and bad guys, is actually really practical as well. If we go back to the example of those who have been indoctrinated into a cult like MAGA or something else, they've been told to expect opposition from us, not love. You can argue with someone who has been indoctrinated until the cows come home, but it is love that builds trust, love that builds safety, love that builds the security that someone needs to be able to walk back from that kind of mental imprisonment. The Jesus way is to break down the walls, to love, forgive, give, and do not condemn someone to otherness, but rather get to know the common humanity that you share. This is perhaps more important for us right now than anywhere else when it comes to our identity as Christians. Oh boy, are the followers of Jesus good at drawing invisible lines and then calling those on the other side heretics or worse. Your identity as a Christian or not Christian is not defined by your position, politics, ethics, or theology. Paul tells us in no uncertain words, you are a Christian if you have faith in Jesus. That is, you trust in him, try to listen and follow him, accept him as your Lord, and come to him as a little child, receiving his forgiveness when we inevitably fail. Whether you are Christian or not is not defined by your position on divorced people remarrying, same-sex marriage, and nor is it based on abortion. Jesus refuses to let us divide his kingdom along those lines. By all means, disagree and stand for what you believe in, but in all things, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you. Then your reward will be great, and you will be children of the Most High, because he is kind to the ungrateful and the wicked. After all, we best never forget that there was a time in our lives, and will no doubt again, when because we are stubborn, when we are opposed to God, we are happy to continue in our addictions, our lusts, our greed, our selfishness. We have all been asked by Jesus for that metaphorical glass of water, and all have refused because we are human. And God, whilst we were in a state of opposition, loved us, turned the other cheek to our insults, gave time and again to us, blessed us, and did not condemn us, but rather rescued us from sin and death and slavery. There is an all too human tendency that we all have to want to divide the world up into good guys and bad guys and find ourselves on the side of good. It feels good, after all, to know that you are one of the good guys. But Jesus refuses to let us draw such lines. Time and again, his teachings blur the line between good guys and bad guys, friend and enemy. Because in the ultimate struggle for the fate of the universe, the God of love wins. And there is no opposition to that. In the end, there is only one side: love. Following Jesus by loving God through loving each other is our only identity marker, the only signpost to our true self, and the only sure answer to the question, are we the bad guys?